What's up everybody, welcome back to Make Quick Crafts, and today we're continuing our D&D character backstory series focusing on the party's ranger DeLocke, whose real name is Cobit. For this build we're starting with styrofoam cut in a few different sizes to create varied terrain levels, and then after measuring out a space for our stone sigil, I carved out a section underneath to house the LED strand that we'll be using for the lights. Once everything was glued together, I flipped over the top layer and carved out a groove to run the LEDs through the diorama. Since I'll be using the same strand for the portal, sigil, and magical attack, I want to make sure the lights can be strung through the entire piece smoothly. Once the lights were secured, I pulled out my Sculpey clay and a brick texture roller to create the sigil. This took a couple of tries, but once I was happy with it, I baked the sigil in the oven for 10 minutes and then secured it to the base. Next, I mixed up some plaster, Mod Podge, and paint to create a terrain paste and began covering the base to prep for priming. Partway through though, I decided the landscape needed more levels to it, so I added some resin rocks from a previous build before finishing up the paste. Once the paste was dry, I gave the whole piece a black primer coat, followed by a green base coat from a spray can. Some of the unprotected foam melted a bit, but honestly, it gave it some nice depth to the terrain, and then once that was all taken care of, I painted the sigil in a stone gray color to set the stage for the rest of the build. Next, I coated the arcane blast section of the LEDs with UV resin to enhance the glow and texture. Next, I started adding in all the natural bits to the terrain by either hot gluing or placing down some Mod Podge before adding all the bits in. And while I add all the natural bits to the terrain, let's dive into DeLocke's backstory. DeLocke, or Cobit, was born into a druidic tribe in Strongwater Grove, the son of a chieftain and a priestess of the forest goddess. However, when he was still very young, his mother was forced to leave the grove due to her sacred duties, leaving Cobit to be raised by his father. Unlike most of the people in his tribe, Cobit never really developed a connection to druidic magic, which strained his relationship with his father. It also made him a bitter rival to one of the grove's most gifted druids, Astyanax. One evening while he was meant to be sleeping, Cobit caught Astyanax sneaking away from the grove and decided to follow her. He watched as she met with a shadow druid, though he couldn't make out their conversation. Before he could investigate further, however, the shadow druid noticed him and attacked, rendering him unconscious. Once Cobit had recovered, he tried to expose Astyanax, but no one believed him. They assumed his mind had either been clouded by trauma or jealousy over his rivalry, and thus feeling isolated and disillusioned, Cobit decided to leave the grove, a place that he never really felt like he belonged in the first place. He took on the name DeLocke from a Jamaican locksmith, and later met Hazel, who we'll cover in the next video, eventually becoming second in command of Crow's Nest Shipping. Okay, so he really didn't get his name that way, but I don't actually recall why the character decided on the name DeLocke and decided to try and make a funny joke to fill time. I promise this will be my last attempt at comedy, unless of course she laughed. Anyway, once the terrain was finished, I covered the sides of the diorama in a black craft foam, and then I sealed off all the gaps off camera with a sculpting foam. I also trimmed up some optic fiber strands and gave them a thin coat of bright purple paint and secured them to the portal using a trick I picked up watching Mini Bricks, which was to use the UV resin as a glue. I was going for a kind of Doctor Strange style portal, which didn't turn out exactly as I planned, but I still thought it looked pretty cool. Once the portal spines were in place, I added another coat of UV resin to keep the magic effect consistent. Then, I moved on to creating the flames for the impact zone using a technique I learned watching North of the Border. I started with a bead of hot glue, teasing out thin layers as it cooled to form random flame-like shapes, and then I painted the flames in increasingly lighter shades of purple to match the arcane blast, and then I secured them in place with UV resin. With the effects done, it was time to paint Cobit, and I kept it fairly simple. Brown contrast paint for the boots, brown acrylic for the paints, a green-brown mixture for the shirt, black hair. I had already painted the other mixtures while watching the Super Bowl with my granddad, so I didn't have the camera rolling for those. I also don't really have a great camera set up for painting miniatures at the moment, but we'll see what the future brings. With the minis finished up, I glued them down and painted the sides of the foam off camera, tested the LEDs one last time, and then ready for some glamour shots. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future builds. We actually surpassed 50 subscribers on the last video alone, which is incredible. I cannot thank you enough, and I look forward to bringing you more projects in the future. But that's all for this one, so I will see you on the next video.